Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Millie and today's video is going to be all about moving to Australia from the UK. Now, just a little bit of background. I have lived in Australia for almost 5 years now, which is absolutely insane to me that that much time has passed, because it literally only feels like yesterday that I moved over, but it's been a whole 5 years. So I feel like I'm probably quite versed, I guess, in this topic of moving from the UK to Australia and the pros and cons. So that's kind of what I'm going to be going through in this video with you guys. The first sort of topic I'm going to talk about is quality of life, and I guess there's a few sort of like subcategories under quality of life. So I'm going to try and sort of speed through them and cover as many as I can. But the first one being healthcare. Now, both Australia and the UK have free healthcare. Australia has Medicare, the UK obviously has the NHS. Now, there are pros and cons to both. Obviously, the NHS is unfortunately very underfunded by the government, and as a result of that, it's very difficult to see the GP. It's very difficult to, like, the wait times in hospital, everything like that. It's really just the NHS is struggling because it's not funded well enough. Now, in Australia, we obviously have a free healthcare system as well, but Australia kind of structure it a little bit differently. So Australians are encouraged to take out private healthcare as well. So a lot of the pressure that would usually be placed on the public system is actually removed because people do go private for quite a few things. Now, obviously, the con of that is people are paying for private health insurance over here in Australia. The benefit is whenever I need to go see the GP, I can see the GP on the same day. And bear in mind as well, I do have private healthcare. However, I do use the public system for like going to the GP and things like that. So I can go see the GP on the day, don't need to have an appointment, can walk in, I can always see a GP there and then. Unreal. When I speak to my family, sometimes they're waiting like 3 weeks in the UK to get a GP, if they can even get through to the clinic, which is just insane. Like, if there's something wrong and it's urgent, like, you need to be able to go and talk to someone. The second thing is the hospitals. Obviously, the UK hospital wait times are astonishing. Like, I feel like you're probably in there for at least 8 to 12 hours if you need to go to A&E. I actually recently had my first experience here in Australia in A&E, and it maybe took me about half an hour to be seen by a doctor. After I was seen by the doctor, it did take a little while for things after that, but that was only because I had to be seen by 2 different specialists. So that took a bit of time. But aside from that, my like experience with the Australian A&E system was so much faster than anything I've ever done in the UK. Now, that being said, Medicare is kind of structured a little bit differently, and there definitely are things that you have to pay for here that you wouldn't have to pay for back home. Some basic prescriptions, for example, you do pay for over here. It is a nominal fee, but you know, for some people, that nominal fee really does make a difference. So just something to consider. And one of the random, really expensive costs here with Australian healthcare is ambulances. I'm pretty sure it costs like $500 or something if you have to get picked up in an ambulance, whereas obviously in the UK it's free. So a lot of people over here, as part of like my health insurance, for example, I have ambulance cover included. So if anything, God forbid, ever happens to me and I need an ambulance, at least the fee will be covered. The second thing in terms of quality of life I wanted to touch on is safety. I feel like Australia honestly must be, I mean, I have no idea, I'm just going to put this out there, but I would assume that Australia is probably one of the safest places in the world. It feels like one of the safest places I've ever been. When I used to live in London and in Manchester, you could not walk with your phone in your hand. If you had your phone in your hand, it was getting snatched, it was getting stolen, you were losing it. You can say goodbye to that phone. Sometimes I actually catch myself over here and I'm walking with my phone in my hand, and I'll hear somebody on a bike and instantly I like grip onto my phone, or I'll try to put it away because I almost forget that I'm not in London or Manchester anymore. I can't speak about other parts of the UK because I've obviously not lived anywhere other than those 2 cities, but I think as a whole, Australia just seems so safe. Like, every place I've been to, or the majority of places I've been to here in Australia, I've felt so safe, so comfortable, have no problems like walking home in the dark or after a night out or anything like that. Like, no concerns about that. And it's always a bit of a culture shock to me, to be honest, when I do go back home to the UK, that instantly I do feel like a little bit more on edge, and I feel like it's a little bit more scary, if that makes sense. Another point is work-life balance, and I feel like loads of people talk about this when they move to Australia, but the work-life balance is just the complete opposite to the UK. In the UK, I feel like you live to work, and in Australia I feel like you work to live. So I mean, if your hours are 9 to 5, best believe you are working 9 to 5 and you're out that door at 5:01, like, you're ready to go. You're up in the morning before you go to work, you're making the most out of your mornings, you're going for a sunrise, you're meeting a friend for a coffee, you're going for a walk, you're doing your run, like whatever it is. And then after the day finishes, you might go down to the beach. Like, you honestly make the most out of every second of your life. And going to work is really just, you're doing that just to fund your life. Whereas I feel like in the UK, people are so wrapped up in work and they work crazy hours, they do all this unpaid overtime, and it's just insane. And the whole balance here is just so wildly different. So the one thing I would say that the UK does win on when it comes to work-life balance would be annual leave. So I'm pretty sure like standard in the UK is 5 weeks of annual leave. The company that I used to work for before I moved over to Australia, I used to get 5 weeks of annual leave, so 25 days, plus they used to give us between 2 to 3 weeks off at Christmas. So basically like 8 weeks in total, which was unbelievable. And in Australia, it's actually standard practice to only get 4 weeks. So very difficult for annual leave, especially if you ever want to travel back home, because that uses like at least 2 or 3 weeks of any annual leave that you might have. So that's definitely one thing that the UK does win on. Moving on to sort of like the cost of living, which I guess is sort of like a sub bracket to quality of life. This is interesting because I feel like for me, I always used to think that Australia was more expensive than the UK. However, it's definitely changed. Like Australia is, in my opinion, definitely cheaper than the UK. Out of interest, actually, just before I started filming this video, I was thinking about rent costs. Obviously, the rent is like one of your largest expenses, right, in life. And I thought, I wonder what the equivalent of this apartment that I live in would cost me in London. Now, obviously, London is zoned, like zone 1 to 6 or whatever. Sydney doesn't have zones, but I imagine where I live, which is the eastern suburbs in Sydney, would probably be the equivalent to like zone 2 in London. So out of interest, I popped onto Rightmove, which is the UK equivalent of Domain, to have a look for a 2-bed, 2-bath apartment with parking that kind of looked similar to the apartment that I live in. So my rent for this apartment is $1,200 a week, which, let's just convert that into pounds and into monthly, because that's obviously how it works in the UK. So that would be roughly £2,700 based on today's currency conversion. For the equivalent, or the best I could find equivalent flat I looked in Battersea, which is in zone 2 in London, it was £4,000, so almost £1,500 more a month for kind of like a similar-ish apartment, which is just insane. Like the rent prices in London are extortionate. I mean, they are in Sydney as well, to be honest. Like what I'm paying for this apartment is extortionate, but that just is what it is, honestly. Of course, if you look outside of the major cities, rent's going to be cheaper, but that's going to be true in both countries. Another pro for Australia when it comes to renting is that your landlord, in the majority of cases, pay your water rates, and they also pay the council tax. Whereas the UK, that property that I just told you guys about, which is £4,000 a month, you'd also have water, electric, I don't know if I had gas, but just say gas, and council rates as well. And your council tax is probably like, I don't know, I haven't been in the UK for a long time, but I'm going to assume that the council tax is probably like £200 a month at least on a 2-bed, 2-bath apartment in zone 2 in London. The other thing when it comes to renting is it's very competitive here in Australia at the moment. We have a rental crisis. I can't really talk about what that's like in the UK at the moment because I obviously, again, haven't been there for 5 years, but I don't know how competitive it is. Back in the UK, I used to work for a real estate company, and it was very easy to get an apartment. Like we always had stuff available. I felt like there was always a constant supply of apartments. This was in Manchester. And there just is not that in Sydney. Sydney is having a huge rental crisis. There are far too many people here versus the amount of apartment buildings and homes that they're building. So that is definitely causing the prices to go up. So something to consider. Can be very competitive to get an apartment, especially if you're moving over here and you don't have a job lined up, you're on a temporary visa or whatever it might be. Like, unfortunately, those things will work against you. However, a lot of people do sublease their rooms, so you always have that option of jumping on a Facebook group and finding a sublease if you are moving over here and you're on a temporary visa, or you don't have work yet, or you only want to find a place that you're going to live in for, like, I don't know, a few weeks, a couple of months, whatever it is before you move on. Aside from rent costs and living costs, I guess the other thing to talk about is the cost of life, basically. So for example, like the cost of food. Now, groceries are definitely more expensive here in Australia. I love going home to the UK and everything's just so cheap in the supermarket. Even if you go to like Marks and Spencer's or Waitrose, which I guess are more of like the higher end supermarkets, so much cheaper than it is over here. My food shop every week here, I don't even want to talk about it because it's gotten so much more expensive. It's just insane. But on the flip side of that, going out to eat here in Australia, like going to like very nice restaurants, even just like standard restaurants, chains, cafes, etc., so much cheaper over here. The last time I went home to the UK, which was about a year ago now, I couldn't believe how expensive everything was. I was in shock as to how expensive it was, considering that another thing is the average salary in the UK, much lower than the average salary in Australia. So whilst yes, groceries is more expensive, your salary is probably likely to be higher in Australia, yet your living costs are probably lower, your food, like your overall going out costs are probably slightly lower. So it's just, yeah, it's pretty insane, the difference in possibilities with salaries and things like that. The next thing to mention would be transport costs, and this is a tricky one. I mean, it's not a tricky one at all, that's a lie. UK, so much more expensive to travel in terms of public transport and cars and things like that than it is here in Australia. Transport for London in the UK, very convenient. The public transport is superior in the UK, I'll give it that, but the costs of it are insane. Every time I feel like I use my Oyster card, I was having to put like £10, £20 on it, which is just insane. The buses and the trains here in Sydney are so cheap, and Sydney itself is pretty good for public transport. Once you go outside of the major cities, of course, public transport drops off, but like it would in the UK as well. And also in terms of having a car, I think having a car is cheaper over here. Like our registration costs are lower, petrol is literally like half the price. However, the one thing that I would say is Sydney, I'm pretty sure, is like the highest tolled city in the world or something like that for the road. So that is one thing to point out. If you are driving, whilst your petrol and everything is cheaper, the tolls here are crazy. In terms of like scenery, I'm gonna call this, I feel like it's kind of hard to compare because that's so subjective as to what you like to do, and both countries have so much to offer. Of course, Australia is going to be superior in terms of the beaches. Australian beaches are quite frequently listed in like the top 100 list of beaches in the world and things like that. So they're obviously going to win that, but Australia is just very diverse. Like we've got the beaches, we've got the rainforest, we've got the mountains. Like there really is a lot going on here. But on the flip side, you know, the UK has the countryside. You've got all of like the quaint little towns and villages and things like that. You obviously have the major cities, which are stunning as well. And they obviously still have some mountain ranges and stuff in the UK. So they're both, depending on what you're into, right? Like depending on what your idea of nice scenery is, I guess would depend on what country you think is better for that. But one thing I would say in terms of, I guess, like lifestyles in those like scenic environments is the UK seems to be very much more indoor focused, and Australia, the lifestyle is very much outdoor focused. You know, your mornings consist of getting out the house, going for walks, going for coffee, going to the beach, going for a swim, a run, a cycle, a surf, like whatever it is. The UK feels very much like you go walk your dog and you go to the bar, you maybe go to the beer garden when it's sunny, but you know, aside from like quite heavily drink focused activities, aside from walking, and of course people do run, cycle and all those things there, but it just seems like Australia, because the weather is nicer, there's a lot more opportunity to do those sorts of things. So I guess another thing to talk about would be the weather, and of course, you know, Australia is generally warmer depending on which part of Australia you decided to live in. You could literally have the sun all year round. Sydney does have seasons. It doesn't get quite as cold as the UK, but it does get cold, contrary to popular belief for English people. But the UK, you know, if you like winter and you like autumn and you like those colder months where you just snuggle up with a blanket and a cup of tea or read a book, whatever it is, then again, it's so subjective as to what you like. Me personally, I'm a summer every day of the year kind of gal, so realistically I should probably move further north than Sydney, because like I said, Sydney does get colder, we do get rain, but somewhere like the Gold Coast, for example, stays pretty warm, like mid-20s all year round, and that would be my dream lifestyle, really. So one thing to speak about is that the distance, and obviously Australia and the UK, opposite sides of the world, couldn't be further apart. Both have pros and cons. If you're moving from the UK to Australia and you're leaving all your family and friends in the UK, then yeah, of course, you're going to be 24 hours minimum away from people at all times. But you just got to make it work if that's what you want to do. If that's the path you want to go down, you know, your family will understand, your friends will understand, you can keep in contact with people. It is a long way. And one thing that Australia definitely, I guess, would have on its cons list is that you are so far really from quite a lot of things. Like, if you want to leave Australia and go on holiday somewhere to another country like Bali, well, New Zealand is obviously quite close, but a lot of the places, you're looking at quite long flights, to be honest. It's not like in England, you know, you can jump on a flight to Europe and you can go to any sort of European country within a couple of hours maybe, like France, Spain, etc. They're all very close. everything is very far from Australia. However, the benefit of Australia is that there's so many countries in this part of the world that are incredible. They are beautiful, they're stunning. Vanuatu, Tahiti, like all of these places that you probably are less likely to ever visit if you live in the UK, because it's a very long flight, and I would imagine a very expensive flight to go to these quite remote, not remote, but you know, they're just so far away from the UK. Fiji, for example, like Fiji is so easy to get to from Sydney. Probably wouldn't fly all the way from London to Fiji unless you were doing it as part of like a big art trip, if that makes sense. So yes, the UK has Europe, but Australia does have all of the Pacific Islands. So again, you've kind of got pros of both, but you know, the nice little short flights to Europe, they're also very cheap, might win a point for the UK over the long flights that you have to do here in Australia, which also then obviously end up being expensive. But I do think it's worthwhile, and like I said, all of the places that you get to experience here is just incredible how stunning all of them are, and it's places that I never thought I would ever go to. Like I never thought I would go to Fiji. I'm hopefully going to be going to Vanuatu next year. Like there's just so many countries that probably wouldn't have been possible for me if I didn't make the move over here. Now career is probably, or like jobs, I guess is probably something that we should touch on. Of course you can have very successful careers in both countries, no doubt. I think if you're moving to Australia from the UK and you're coming over on a temporary visa, you may / can struggle to get yourself set up in like a job that you see like a good career pathway. I think a lot of employers over here are hesitant to hire people on temporary visas, understandably, because you know, why would they want somebody that can only work for a certain amount of time or has some sort of restriction, or they want to pay to sponsor them when they could get an Australian to do the same job and not have to go through any of those things. So I think in that sense, it can be hard when you come over here. If you have a skill or you have a trade or something like that that's in demand here in Australia, then you're probably going to find it easy-ish. I'm not going to say easy, but easy-ish to get yourself set up, get a high-paying job, one that has good career progression and things like that. One of the things that comes with not just moving to Australia, but literally moving anywhere away from home is you run the risk of being lonely. You have to make new friends again. Like you have to go through those processes. And if one thing I have learned in the last 5 years is you have to just put yourself out there to make friends whenever you move into a new area, because if you don't do that, you're going to struggle. You need social connections, right? And if you don't have social connections, you are going to struggle. And sort of hand in hand in that is, particularly in Australia, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but you have to get used to saying bye to people basically. Like you meet so many amazing people, you form so many good friendships, and then people move on, they move back home, they move to another country, like whatever it might be. I think you adapt to that whole, you know, some people are only going to be in your life for a short period of time, others are going to be longer. Like I'm fortunate enough now that all of my friends, or a majority of my friends I should say over here, are here for the long run and are going to be here for the foreseeable future, which is lovely. But I definitely went through a phase where I was making friends and they were all on work and holiday visas, and then they would leave, and then I'd be a bit like, oh, okay, well now I need to make new friends again. So that's definitely something to consider. And you know, it's a bit scary making friends again for the first time. Like I obviously haven't really had to make friends since leaving uni, but yeah, it's definitely pushed me outside of my comfort zone here in Australia, and I've honestly made some of like the best friends of my entire life in the 5 years that I've been here. Likewise, you're obviously going to experience some homesickness. It's just completely natural. You're going to miss things at home. You're going to miss birthdays. You're going to, well, potentially miss weddings and stuff, unless you're willing to fly home for every little thing. Unfortunately, that just comes with living away, and you've just got to decide, you know, what's more important to you, but whether it's worth it for you. Like for me personally, my quality of life and everything else positive that I've said in this video outweighs the negatives of missing family and missing out on special events and things like that back home. The final thing I'm going to talk about is the immigration process. Now, if you are coming out here and you know you just want to do a couple of years, you just want to use your work and holiday visa and go home, you're going to have the best time. Like, put yourself out there, make new friends, say yes to everything. If you want to stay in Australia, let me prepare you for a long and expensive and stressful pathway. The rules in Australia are changing all the time for immigration. Honestly, I feel like every few months there's changes to immigration, what's on the skills list, what isn't, what can be sponsored, what can't be. prices for things, the cost of lawyers. So just something to consider. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I 100% all of the money that I've spent to stay in this country has been worth it, but just something to know ahead of hand. I'm sure if it was the other way around and it's Aussies moving to the UK, it's equally as hard and as expensive, but just something that is nice to know if you do intend on staying here for 5 years or longer, or hopefully settling down forever maybe. Anyway, I'm going to end this video here because I don't want it to be too long, although I could literally talk about this topic for days and days on end. So if you do have any questions, please pop them down below. If you have any experiences, I would love to hear them. If you did like this video and it was useful to you, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. If not, I'll see you guys in my next video.